a lot of these old witch hunting books, like from this period of time, they absolutely gave people ideas as much as they made people afraid, their intention being to discourage certain behaviors. But, if you're putting these ideas out in the world, especially if they're luridly illustrated, right, which the demonology was, and Spare's illustrations, his sort of unofficial illustrations of psychopathia sexualis function the same way, like, sort of daring you to look and to reckon with this. The history of magic is very plagued by binary thinking about gender, especially once you get into 20th century ceremonial magic, and there's, the very essentialized roles of the man and the woman, and then a lot of systematic exclusion of queer magical practitioners, and this is one of the reasons I'm teaching a class called Queerness and the Occult, is to introduce a non-binary perspective into how we understand some of these sacred ideas.
Well, this is Mutant Manifesto episode 27. It's just me and Alex A. Jones here. Alex writes about art ecology and the occult. Jones is a 2022 recipient of the Andy Warhol Art Writers Guild grant and the inaugural recipient in 2024 of the Jonathan Barbara Silver Foundation grant for writing on sculpture. She's part of the experimental film collective Studio Verosa, featured in a previous Mutant Manifesto episode, and a co-founder of the Queer Ecologies Research Collective. Alex, how's it going? Welcome to Mutant Manifesto once again. Glad to have you.
Well, I recall lots of tangents around hermetic philosophy and the sort of lonely alchemist, character that informs a lot of the Verosa films there. So this is sort of another angle on a lot of that material.
Right. In that previous episode we did with Verosa, we talked about the alchemical themes that came up in pretty much all of their works so far. But we were focused more on horror and experimental film. And the impetus for this episode is in part to follow up on that, and also to highlight Alex's upcoming spring class series. She'll be leading them on Sundays starting April 6th and going until May 4th. These classes are available for people to sign up for still, if I can get this out soon enough. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's generally entitled Queerness and the Occult, and it has different sub-themes throughout. Can you tell me more about why and how teaching a class like this has come about for you?
Yeah, this is a new experiment for me. As I probably would have introduced myself in some variation last time we spoke, I identify as a writer, but a lot of the ways that I work as a writer are experimental and multimedia. This is where screenwriting and experimental film come in, and also where experiments in pedagogy come in. A lot of these ideas under this huge umbrella of queerness and the occult are ideas that in my sort of day job as a art and culture critic don't really see the light. There are a lot of ideas that are difficult to put into words kind of by definition. When we're talking about the occult, we are in the one sense talking about the arcane mysteries. And it's a lot of my most important research that I feel much more drawn to talking with people about and kind of lecture performing about than I do in chiseling anything in stone, so to speak, even if that's just publishing texts on the internet. So I'm excited about teaching this class series, which came about through the invitation of Laetitia Barbier. She's hosting this class through her online platform, Laetitia Cartomancy. Laetitia is a really, really incredible teacher of the tarot. she and I met during some artist retreat this past summer and got to talking on a 300-year-old farmhouse porch about non-binary imagery in hermetic philosophy. A very rare conversation to get to enter into with somebody. And Laetitia has an amazing approach to teaching the tarot, which is very intuitive. At the same time, though, one of the ways we can understand what the tarot is as a vehicle for, esoteric belief systems and as a historical lineage of some of the archetypal and symbolic imagery that constitutes the Western esoteric tradition. So Laetitia has been branching out and inviting other scholars of these topics, Hermeticism, the Kabbalah, et cetera, to talk about those topics more broadly, which is really exciting. There's more and more of this sort of self-education available online that is exciting to me because, I I am not a scholar of the occult in any formal sense. I do not have a PhD. To me, that is similar to saying that I am not an initiate of any formal esoteric order or cult or coven. I've always operated as an outsider and as more of a practitioner of magic than a scholar of it. And so I'm excited to have a platform of any kind to be able to talk about this stuff with like-minded people. And I'm really curious to see how it goes. So yeah, it'll be 5 lectures on Sundays, like church, and that'll cover different themes within this incredibly broad topic of queerness and the occult.
Yeah, definitely. I relate to the that sense of like not being kind of authorized to talk about esoteric things on like a scholarly level, and I also haven't done as much like reading, even of like the foundational texts of Western occultism, as I would like to have as I would like to have. But I think these things are broadly available online for people to like look into at this point, and so like their status as a cult is like a little bit more illuminated than a cult, but almost like because of the dearth of information available online and the dearth of different types of people presenting different types of information and different slants on things, I find it frustrating sometimes, and sometimes I crave the guidance of like a tutor or
Mm-hmm.
a guide or a teacher.
Sure. Yeah, because things get buried and the primary sources are very dusty and difficult. And, I think it's interesting that I'm sure some of the very first things that started being populated on the internet were arcane sacred texts, because, one of the things about occultists is that they are fascinated with and concerned with how knowledge is transmitted. And so the internet in its emergence was very exciting to esoteric practitioners, and, as this new way that information could be shared and also remain as secret as it ever was, right? Because, yeah, who's going to be able to interpret this material and who's going to find it? And a lot of the great online versions of, you know, primary sources of really old Western esoteric texts are like, they clearly were uploaded in HTML in like 1989, like
Mm-hmm.
they're really old. And yeah, it's difficult to parse through this stuff in general. And this class I'm designing as very much not for the specialist. Again, queerness and the occult, that's very totalizing kind of theme anyway. And I have, a fetish for dusty tomes, but I don't think that everyone should or does, and that you don't need to start to dip your toes into these ideas. So that's why I wanted to be very broad in formulating the course, kind of skim across the surface of a lot of different topics to hopefully give people ideas about where they might want to investigate deeper.
actually one of the pieces that I found on your website, even back when we did the Verosa discussion, was your analysis or kind of send up of Austin Osman Spare's Psychopathia Sexualis for Broken Rail in 2022. And I mean, Austin Osman Spare is a, in the like chaos magician online esotericist from Western kind of lineage. I feel like his body of work is one of the few kind of consensus pieces we could start with almost.
Sure. Well, I mean, he's become more and more well known.
Right, right.
In his lifetime, Spare was very obscure, and in fact, like left the spotlight of artistic society in his life to become a hermit, basically. And it's a great example to me of how this work unfolds transhistorically. When you're involved in these lineages of esotericism, the relationship to time becomes really interesting. When I wrote that piece for the Brooklyn Rail, Spare was having the first exhibition of his work in the United States ever, and it's 100 years after this body of work, the Psychopathia Sexualis, was made. And I think part of the appeal of, becoming a scholar or practitioner of esoteric traditions is how you can shift the relationship of your work in time, that sometimes it's decades, sometimes it's centuries before that work is going to be continued or discovered, whether it's lingering on some old HTML webpage or, uncovered in a vault, like those drawings of Spares. And one of the angles of this class, Queerness in the Occult, is about picking up certain threads in very old strains of Western esotericism, kind of queering ideas in alchemy and hermetic philosophy, and asserting that this is not merely revisionism of those old ideas. It's not at all. It's a continuation of that work.
Yeah, it's kind of a tangent from what we previously discussed to talk about here, but I wonder if maybe I could read a little bit of your writing on Spare's art, because he was an artist and esotericist,
Yes.
and we could kind of go from there and kind of enter into some of the topics that I'm most interested in here, which are basically this question of dichotomization and then stitching between dichotomies, and how that becomes a kind of trellis with which to explore esoteric and kind of transcendent aspects of identity and reality.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So, like, you talk about Osmond's drawings here. You say, quote, typical pornography sanitizes bodies and sexual acts, but Spare's drawings seek the opposite extreme, visualizing a grotesque menagerie of sexual beings men, women, beasts, and bodily encounters spanning sadomasochism, comedy, and obscenity. Huge deflated genitals recall those seen in Japanese shunga, but instead of demure robes, the attached figures are clothed in body hair and rolls of flesh. They piss and shit with pleasure. The drawings aim to excite us with the corporeality, that is, the corpse reality of sex. Unquote. So it's but I think that what's interesting is I was thinking about Osmond Spare's kind of discussion of desire as something that's really key to um, opening up magical possibilities for oneself and for one's world. But the desire that he lays out, I think he says that it has to be sublimated, it has to be unconscious, subconscious, in order to really have teeth. If I, understand that correctly. And I think it's interesting to have a sort of pornographic works here that kind of by design skirt the lines between like what is something that you can properly think of as sexy and something that is uncomfortable and almost like body horror esque or
Yeah, right,
truly
right.
lewd or something.
And which is ultimately queer sexuality, right? As
Precisely
the
right.
queer as in not acceptable, not normal. by the social standards. This body of work is named Psychopathia Sexualis after the very famous Richard Kraft von Ebing text by that name, which was this hugely popular Victorian catalog of sexual perversity. We actually get terms like homosexuality from this book, which attempted to pathologize non-normative sexuality. As Michel Foucault discusses in The History of Sexuality, the Victorians were not prudish about sex, actually. They were obsessed with it, and particularly obsessed with policing its boundaries. And so for Spare to name this work, which he created in the 1920s, very self-consciously after von Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, he was already subverting this really important text that was about limiting what sexualities were allowed and pathologizing deviant sexualities. And so Spare was making images of a lot of these deviant sexualities, these sadist and like bestial and homoerotic sexualities. And again, this was an incredibly subversive gesture because not only was this all considered very, very pathological, very queer, very not normal, but creating pornography in itself in England was illegal at the time. So, there's a reason that these drawings ended up, they were not in the public light, right? Going back to what I was talking about, what it, and this is, I think, an especially kind of chaos magic idea, right? Like your work playing out over a long period of time, like these works couldn't see the light of day in Spare's world. Like he would be actually criminalized for creating them. And so instead they languish in a box somewhere until the time comes that they can actually be publicly exhibited.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's something about having something boxed and preserved in a box that I think also is echoed by pathology itself, saying that there's different categories for queerness, different categories for deviance, that is able to capture and therefore control these deviant individuals or deviant acts. I think Foucault might even mention that like a prohibition on gay sex essentially isn't saying that it doesn't happen. It almost kind of defines its existence in a certain way.
Yeah, and ends up promoting it, right? And this
Mhm.
is where the idea of chaos magic comes in, right? That of the fact that there's a lot of energy out in the world, and it's very hard to predict how it's going to work. And the practice of chaos magic is about engaging with that process and trying to bend that process a little bit, trying to insert certain ideas or desires into the universe so that they might boomerang back into reality, translating things from the imaginal to the material plane, finding ways to do that, to manifest things as, the very trendy term outside of that context.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it didn't just happen with this sexuality either. Like there's an echo that I find really fascinating between Ebbing's Psychopathia Sexualis and the King James demonology from,
Mm.
hundreds of years
Mhm.
before, like
Mhm.
another significant work that was trying to demonize, literally it was trying to demonize practices that were called witchcraft, and trying to take very old folkloric and pagan entities and turn them into something evil. This is coming out of the time of the persecution of witchcraft in Europe, and here particularly in England. And it's really funny because the King James demonology became a really popular work. People were fascinated by it. And this is the same reason that people were fascinated by Psychopathia Sexualis. And everybody, all these Victorians had to get their hands on this because it was describing all of these lurid things that were very fascinating. And a lot of these old witch hunting books, like from this period of time, They absolutely gave people ideas as much as they made people afraid, their intention being to discourage certain behaviors. But, if you're putting these ideas out in the world, especially if they're luridly illustrated, right? Which the demonology was, and Spare's illustrations, his sort of unofficial illustrations of psychopathia sexualis function the same way, like, sort of daring you to look and to reckon with this, and that there might be some chaos in that.
It's this idea that I think is found in alchemy as well, that you have to, like a seed, you have to plant a seed in the darkness and in the like fertile like shit, the like non glamorous, the thing that you don't want to see or uh, be with or reckon with, but you have to plant something there in order for like the most amazing flowers or whatever to bloom.
Right. And even, the thing that you can't understand right away, or the thing that has many meanings, the role of images in the transmission of ideas is incredibly important to alchemy.
Hmm.
I think this is certainly true for me, and I think it's probably true for a lot of people who end up interested in the hermetic philosophy. You start with this fascination with alchemical art. You start
Hmm.
to see the treatises, the illustrated texts, and these incredible paintings, these illuminated manuscripts, and you're like, wow, what is this? What is this about? Like, and then you find yourself falling down the deepest rabbit hole of all time.
Hmm.
But one of the characteristics of alchemical art is, of course, this really Baroque layered symbolism. I'm talking about Renaissance alchemical art in particular, with one of the reasons that the Renaissance is remembered as this period of the flourishing of knowledge in Europe has everything to do with the practice of alchemy and the flourishing of the Hermetic philosophy at this time, in its achievements in art and science and all of that. But yeah, the artworks have all of these very layered symbols. You'll encounter symbols for chemical elements of sulfur, mercury, lead, but they also have metaphysical dimensions to those symbols that are arguably more important than their material dimensions. And part of the teaching, the sort of the shape of content of those works, is that everything has multiple meanings. You're never really done trying to interpret those alchemical illuminated manuscripts, because they are multi-layered, and they speak to a cosmos that is complex and requires a lot of subtlety and study to understand. And this is part of, I guess, an entry point into my interest in queering the Hermetic philosophy and queering
Hmm.
alchemy. I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of room. There's an inherent appreciation for ambiguity and mutability in this philosophy.
Yeah, so this kind of almost comes to kind of the crux of one of my big pieces of almost like discomfort or like curiosity with Western occultism and the role of the like hermaphrodite or of the queer in
Mm-hmm.
that trans becoming, a lot of queer becoming is characterized by this dance between terror and desire and shame, because of the because once you see something in yourself or you're frightened by something in someone else and but yet resonate with it, like the more you try to push it away, the more it comes back up in different ways, and you start to encounter the inevitability of identification with it and therefore the destruction of the self you previously thought you were or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Becoming is a process, as we are
mhm.
horrified to learn.
Yeah, and it's an angst. It can be a very anxious process,
Mhm.
and I think that that relates to the experience of digging into esoterica when you start to find these different, scabs and scars that end up actually being living whole new appendages, that you can utilize. And it's like, this is a whole different type of body than I'm used to, a whole different type of navigation of the world than I thought was possible. And so that can be quite unsettling in the same way that queerness can. But so that being said, I think like Osman Spare is one example, but I think this is common of a lot of different esoteric philosophers and people that have laid down grimoires and stuff of the past, even going back to like ancient times and like maybe, I don't know, like Ovid's Metamorphosis even, where you
Hmm.
get where you have a lot of transformation and queerness that's highlighted. But we have, I don't know if it's because of the patriarchal gloss of its constant reinterpretations throughout time, or if it's part of the source material throughout time. But there is a tendency towards a type of essentialism and misogyny that kind of starts coming up a little bit, where you see female as one essential thing, male as one essential thing, and then like the synthesis of those two energies within somebody has some sort of powerful transcendent quality. So
Yeah.
I guess the
Yeah.
question is, what is the place of the actual? I guess the question kind of becomes like, are we talking about an actual queer person or like an actual intersex person when we talk about a
Mhm. When
hermaphrodite? Or
when we
are we
talk about
talking
the
about some?
alchemical androgyne or the hermaphrodite or the rebus. Yeah.
So I think, almost as like a point of order, what do you think about that question? And I don't know. Is there any like historical inklings you have about like the connection between those two potentially different things?
Yeah, well, one of my primary heresies, that I've pissed off other mystics about plenty of times is my lack of faith in, a divine masculine and divine feminine order. I think it's projection. And my interest is in the non-binary, and this is one of the reasons I'm teaching a class called Queerness and the Occult, is to introduce a non-binary perspective into how we understand some of these sacred ideas, because of course, the history of magic is very plagued by binary thinking about gender, especially once you get into 20th century ceremonial magic, and there's the very essentialized roles of the man and the woman, and then a lot of systematic exclusion of queer magical practitioners. That there's a lot of binary kind of prejudice and essentializing of gender that happens. But to me, when you start to dig back into the older sources, I think you find that that's all mirroring social projection. That's really mirroring the evolution of a humanistic binary way of thinking about gender. There's a strong pattern of belief just globally, transhistorically, that any supreme divinity or original life form would naturally encompass all the characteristics of male and female, and would, in other words, be non-binary or dual natured. In the Gnostic Gospels and in the early Talmudic texts like the Book of Enoch, we see that the original beings, the supreme kind of divinities in the world, were androgynous beings, and it was the patriarchal god of Abraham, big sky daddy, who was actually just a privileged son of these older androgynous forces, who was the one who split man and woman. And of course these are heretical texts within a modern Abrahamic like tradition, so they're not to be believed, right? But when you look at these older ideas, there is not a given polarity between masculine and feminine. It's something that comes later. And when it comes to the Renaissance alchemists and their reverence for this image of the androgyne or the hermaphrodite, there's definitely an awareness of those old beliefs. The Hermetic philosophy comes out of a lot of that Gnostic territory in late antiquity. And they were aware of, in Plato, Aristophanes tells a story about how, you know people were originally, had two bodies and eight limbs and two heads, and, male and female were combined. And then it was Zeus who split them. And the quest to reunify those two halves is Eros. It's this beautiful little allegory about what it means to become. And for the alchemists, whose central quest was for the enlightenment of the soul, the transformation of consciousness, the reunification with a divine monad, with the singular anima mundi, right? One of the most important ideas, one of the most important processes is the resolution of opposites. And the rebus figure, the hermaphrodite, is a symbol of that process. And so, one of the main contradictions that I think people experience, one of the main perceived polarities is that of masculine and feminine. But it's not the only contradiction or polarity that we hold within us. And so, that rebus figure is symbolic not of the masculine and feminine, the king and queen, right? Although that's part of it, it's really a symbol of the reconciliation of paradoxes within oneself, and this as the really important step in the great work. And because I'm also not here to talk about how, like, there was anything gender progressive about Renaissance alchemy. I mean, there were a handful of women who are remembered, who were allowed to practice the art, but for the most part, people who were not powerful men were persecuted and killed for practicing mystic philosophy, basically. So there is a paradox between the theoretical reverence of the hermaphrodite and then the actual socialized experience of where androgyny really manifested. It was considered queer and demonic and evil. And there's always that is a gap between theory and practice, right? But this is where, like I said, to me it just means that that work is not finished. To me there is a lot of room for queer interpretation within these hermetic ideas of the androgyne, and of the reconciliation of opposites, of the fundamental transmutability of the self, of the soul. And so we just, we don't worry about it. I've heard it cynically kind of alleged that the Renaissance alchemist fascination with the rebus is a symptom of them wanting to not need actual women within their cosmology, like within the male practitioner, you could be everything. You could be masculine and feminine, and so you didn't need women. But I'm not really bothered by that because they're all dead.
Yeah, it's like yeah, I like to I mean there's also this like fascination with the homunculus, right? Which is like an attempt to create life without a, going through the whole, slog of actually impregnating
Yeah,
a woman and
exactly,
like, yeah, and
exactly.
like dealing with like birth, right?
Right.
Which is all, all of that stuff gets you very much into like bloody embodiment and like so yeah. It seems like your project is a tracing the existence and fixation on queerness throughout this lineage, but it's also, like you said, like an ongoing, active, living process of queering esoterica, both in the past and in the present, both in opening up. And so I guess maybe that's something to pause on. Like when you say queering in that way, you're not simply speaking about turning your disciples trans or gay, but although that might be an aspect of it, can you elaborate a little bit more about like what this type of monstrous, perhaps queerness is that you are proposing as instrumental in esoterica?
Yeah, of course.
Continually
I
in
mean,
contact with.
defining what we're talking about when we talk about queerness or queer embodiment is obviously really important because, I think the idea of queerness, because it's fundamentally non-essentialist,
Hmm.
it resists any concrete definition. It's a very open and also very contested kind of term. And the reason why this topic, I was going to come up with this like a sexier title for the class. And then I was like, queerness and the occult is already very provocative because the
Hmm.
terms to me kind of define each other in a way in this context. Like, queer embodiment is about, a body which defies some socially prescribed or enforced categories of what's normal and acceptable, right? And I think you could say that the body of knowledge that is identified as the occult is all of that, is the totality of knowledge that lies outside of or contradicts the dominant culture and its beliefs. In other words, the dominant scientific culture. And so there's something innately queer about occult knowledge in that it lies outside of and in fact is essential in defining the norm. I think of queerness and the occult as sort of a subaltern theory, right? We're not just talking about what is outside of the norm, but we're talking about the
Mm.
things that the norm needs to define itself. It needs to exclude and
Hmm.
persecute
Hmm.
what is queer, what is occult, in order to define itself. Queerness and the occult are both kind of operating on the bad side of the dark side of Western culture in this context, especially because of the way that for me queerness is an idea that really calls into question the historical construct of nature. Nature is a social construct that can only define itself by saying that certain things are unnatural. This is relevant to both queer identity, which is defined as unnatural, monstrous, uh, constantly, and also around occult ideas, essentially relational or magical ideas about how the world works that contradict an atheist materialist worldview, basically. So the two terms, queerness and the occult, in this context are very wrapped up, they're braided together for me. And part of my interest is in exploring them together. And it's also why I'm not, I'm not interested really in like the dominant history of Western esotericism, whatever that means, like it's already sort of an oxymoron, right? But there are actually academia is flooded with scholars of Western esotericism as it's become more acceptable. And I'm not here to tell a history of like secret brotherhoods and, initiations and, the guys that got famous. Like,
Hmm.
I'm here to explore the the ideas, the beliefs that have been marginalized and where there is still a lot of work to do to recover them. And ideas that I think are especially valuable to people who do identify as queer,
Mm.
where there's been no place in modern religion or spirituality or whatever for queerness. And in fact, what we now call queerness is not a new idea. There is a lot of precedent for that which is interstitial and liminal and transient and mutable and ambiguous. These are actually transhistorically very sacred qualities. And I'm interested in exploring those ideas to reconnect people with them who I think will value them a lot.
Mhm.
Because the alchemist's obsession with the hermaphrodite is not isolated. When you dig deep enough into transhistorical religious patterns, there is always an ambiguous or mutable aspect to divinity. You can look at any deity you want, deities being the personifications of divine ideas, right? And find that there are dual natures and changing states, and come to the conclusion that the divine itself is the ability to transcend or reconcile apparent dualities.
It's no I think other like cousin words of like queerness and the occult are like the deviant and the savage, things like that, like the unnatural, as you mentioned. I think it's interesting. I feel like these, and I feel like also the English language is very much structured around definitions that are binary. You are this thing or that thing, and to even explain what someone is, you have to use dichotomized terms. And then through poetry and through like mutating language, through colloquialisms and complex recoding, you can get an emergent meaning that can slip between the definitions and cast a more generous portrait of somebody. For example, like if you're trying to describe why you love somebody, you have to get really creative. You have to get very inventive.
And you have to use more verbs. It's more of a process
Mm-hmm.
than a thing. And this is, I guess, another facet of my appreciation for alchemy as the kind of practicum of the hermetic
Mm.
philosophy. It's like, you can't just read these ideas in books and get it. You have to do it. You have to actually practice these things. And there's a verb in that, that becoming and transformation are active processes, not states that we attain. But yeah, I mean, this idea that you bring up of like falling between categories and how that's sort of what we want to be able to do. This also makes me think of monstrosity, of the monster, and the how falling in between categories is how you end up as a monster in like humanist culture, right? And so there's a lot of exploration of monsters in this curriculum as well. You've actually got my head spinning about the homunculus now too,
Mm-hmm.
this like proto transhumanist, like this perfect male offspring. Anyway,
No, that's certainly,
just
yeah, I
another
know.
monster.
Well, it's kind of like the like monster that's trying not to. It's like someone trying to make a non-monster. It's like a
Hmm.
less monstrous version of someone than a person, which is definitely still alive. That project.
And but was also intended to be subhuman, right? To be
Mm. Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I will be like pulling readings from, or an extract from, for the class is from Caliban and the Witch, Sylvia Federici's very influential book about the sort of class politics of the witch hunts. And she talks about Shakespeare's Caliban, as this magical other. And this is where the idea you bring up about like the savage is connected to queerness and the occult as well. This subaltern other that was always a really interesting character in adaptations of Shakespeare because of how he would be made monstrous. How it was just assumed that Caliban would have this queer body, would be black or disfigured. And, that's not even in the text. Like,
Mm.
but this projection that happens because the character is this magical other that needs to become a monster because it doesn't fit in this, rational worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that fear and desire that animates a lot of the colonial projects. It like
Mm-hmm.
creates others to extract both meaning and also resources and also superiority and fear of. It's a very schizophrenic project that continues to try to find new sites of exploitation, but
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to
And
try to,
yeah.
because the thing about colonialism also is that it does structure one's identity in an automaton like way, like
Mm-hmm.
the colonial subject, the person who carries out the colonial projects, even if you're on the colony side of it, you are almost more you actually are more subject to its clutches.
Yeah, you are a subject to these binary oppositions that need to define everything. And I mean, you can take any monster, any modern monster, certainly, and see how it straddles binaries of human and animal, living and dead, male and female. Monsters come out of these shadowy areas of a rational culture that insists on separating things into these clear categories where there's always a power dynamic, between those categories, always a good guy and a bad guy. And, part of the reason that monsters are so fascinating is because they come out of these ontological blind spots. Michael Martyr said a better version of that idea, which is that where the questioning impulse is dormant, ontological chimeras will rear their heads without delay. When we don't question why we think humans are categorically different or better than animals, for instance, we will begin to be haunted by that boundary, with, becoming frightened of things that remind us uncannily of the lack of difference, the lack of a clear line. I think that that's a very modern or postmodern way of understanding monsters. The queer theorist Jack Halberstam has written about monsters as a post-gothic technology, he calls it, bringing up Frankenstein, right? Sort of related to the homunculus idea, but I mean, in the 19th century, how Frankenstein really changed the game of monstrosity by inventing this genre where we could use monsters to examine our collective psychology and cultural fears. And I do think that that's a modern and very fruitful approach, I think. And also, queer and post-colonial identification with monstrosity is a lot about picking at those seams, right? Like where you're identifying those monsters as ontological problems, and those ontological problems can become useful as well. You can almost weaponize them.
Yeah, Frankenstein seems like a good touchstone too. I mean, notably created by a woman. I mean, the novel. I mean, or the book,
Mm-hmm.
and was it
Yeah,
and was about like an academic man trying to reach to new scientific heights and being met by the queerness of the world, of
that's
unexpected,
right.
of truth, which is ever changing and ever fleeting, and which also makes you come back to your own traumatic associations with things like, again, one's mother, or
Mm-hmm.
one's lovers, or like the things that make you queer that are so terrifying therefore.
Yeah. Well, and Frankenstein is punished, of course, for his hubris in the creation
Mm-hmm.
of his monster. And I think there's a really important bridge to older conceptions of monstrosity. This is an area like of really particular interest to me right now in my
Mm-hmm.
research. It's like, what are there's always been things we identify as monsters, but I think they've meant different things over time. And in the class, I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into Medusa, the Gorgon, who's always a popular one, especially within feminist and queer readings of
Mm-hmm.
monstrosity, because she is this famous victim of the white male hero,
Mm-hmm.
Perseus. But I'm hoping to approach it in a different light by tracing the Gorgon to the the chthonic deity of
Mm-hmm.
Nemesis.
Mm-hmm. Oh hell yeah.
And in order to explore what monsters meant to the original audience of that story, because I don't, Frankenstein hadn't come out yet, right? Like I think it was
Mm-hmm.
something about something different. So Nemesis was one of the daughters of Nyx, in Greek mythology, one of the original deities of fate, very similar to the Moire, to the three fates. But Nemesis in particular became known for being in charge of punishments, particularly of humans who, men who tried to resist fate and who would ultimately be checked by cosmic forces, because humans were very smart and very resourceful and very powerful, but you can't argue with the higher powers. And that, so nemesis, this in the term now nemesis means like enemy, right? It's related to the monster in that modern sense of the bad guy. But really, she was the one whose job it was, whose divine mandate it was to keep humans in their place. And one thing I find interesting about the story of Medusa and Perseus is I'm not so sure that the original audience of that story had a black and white view of who was the good guy and who was the bad guy in that story. I think that much like, in the Odyssey, Odysseus, when you actually read it, he's not, he's not a hero. He's kind of fucking up. And I think Perseus as well is sort of the heel of that story. At least that's my instinct about it, that it was more of a tragedy about mankind killing this older power, refusing to obey the limits of the cosmic order. So I see monsters in this transhistorical sense as agents of fate. And I also think that that's a very interesting and potentially empowering idea for queerness now, as we see a lot of identification with the monster, monsters becoming kind of very important archetypes or avatars of queerness. It's important to look at transhistorically what have monsters been for, and they've been about kind of protecting these older forces of the universe.
I wanted to shout out episode 8 of Mutant Manifesto with Ione Richards, who I think you'll have really nice, interesting discussions with. She's like a very intelligent astrologer. It was about Nemesis and Fortuna. Yeah. But we talked about Medusa a little bit as well there. Medusa certainly has been adopted by a lot of survivors of sexual violence, and also
Totally.
just like queer and femme people in general. And it is interesting when you say this about, because the idea of again, like queerness and fate, like fate being queer, because it is something that you can't plan for. It's something that puts you in contact with, again, parts of yourself, parts of reality that you would never have expected or desired originally,
right.
or
and
wanted
situations
to desire.
you don't have control over, the constraints upon becoming and desiring that we can't control. It's a very frustrating thing, but I also think it's going to be having a resurgence of popularity. I mean, we live in times where ecological collapse is upon us, and there's nothing any of us can really do. There's very little we can do, and there some of that futility has a home in these old ideas of fatalism, and there's like structures of meaning there that can be recovered. And the way to move forward is partly through monstrosity, through the ability to adapt and to embrace the the categorical imperfection of what we need to become. I think one of the reasons that Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto became, easily one of the most influential texts of the late 20th century in critical theory is because of how it tied post-humanism to qualities of monstrosity or queerness through this speculative figure of the cyborg, who we might understand as a monster, a mutant, just another version of this. In dominant cultural circles, the idea of post-humanism usually signifies some kind of transcendent science fiction version of man, where he can upload his consciousness and grow his homunculi in test tubes and travel to space and survive outside of planetary ecologies. But there's a completely different way to understand the idea of posthumanism,
Mhm.
which is captured in Haraway's manifesto, which is actually about moving beyond the humanistic conception of nature and the binary understanding of knowledge, with all of its black and white categories and its entangled systems of oppression. It's really about getting past humanism.
Yeah. Um,
And that relates back to the history of Western esotericism because, the historical process through which rational humanism became so powerful involved the literal persecution and murder of many people and cultures that defied those categories. And so, again, my own interest in the history of the occult is a subaltern one, you know.
Medusa having snake hair. This relationship between the central head and then like a network of subheads of, and that relates to Donna Haraway's more recent "Staying with the Trouble," her fixation on chthonic entities, on like tentacles, tendrils, cords, roots. That's just an interesting thing here. I think that can just kind of be a symbol that I wanted to highlight, and then into this question that I have that I've been genuinely really wanting guidance on, like almost on a personal level, which is like it's asked so many times in esoteric communities that I'm a part of, that I've become um, aware of, and I never seem to have a satisfying answer, which maybe is the truth. But what do you think the relationship between wanting something and magic is or should be? Like when we have, for example, a world that we know is toxic or whatever, what does it mean to want, for example, a happy life? What is, and then but then also, like, what does it mean to want the destruction of, like Elon Musk to die or something? Is a goal important in magic for you? And this is, I'm just kind of generally asking, and maybe how does that relate to this idea of like fate being queer and unintended? Because even if we have queer goals, like we want queer liberation, right? We want like free Palestine. Is magic a place that we can look for this, and or should look for these kinds of goals?
Totally. Well, as I digest that bigger question, that bigger topic, just to button up this like resonance with the Medusa symbol and the cyborg, the mutant, the monster. There's a few things going on here, right? With the head of Medusa with the serpents, and then ultimately, the decapitated head. And the solo head of the Gorgon is an image that precedes the myth of Perseus. She was often depicted as just a face, like a mask. And the first thing is that we have a composite entity here, right? A chimera. There is a sort of a human body, but then there's also these animal bodies. And a lot of times the oldest significances of composite entities are related to these chthonic forces like you're talking about, like before we were human, right? When you have an animal human hybrid, part of what that often means is like speaking to the archaic nature of something, like before it was human in a humanistic sense, like it was animal. And then also serpents are pretty much found in the iconography of every esoteric tradition, certainly in the Western narrative, as symbols of secret knowledge. Again, going back to the kind of Gnostic origins of a lot of these heretical ideas. The serpent in the Garden of Paradise is not the bad guy. He's the one inviting Eve to take of the knowledge. And so we always have serpents standing in for the hidden and secret understanding of things. And so, yeah, it's a very charged image, and it leads you down all sorts of more complex musings about that original story of Perseus and Medusa. Like, wait a second, is this really just a black and white story of the good guy killing the monster? I don't know. I think it's about something more complicated. But anyway, this other topic of, the way that magic works. I mean, historically speaking, I think one of the purposes of magic is to create change. The spiritual and physical transformation of the practitioner of magic is the central thing. And it's a process that must start internally. Before you can expect to affect anything outside of yourself, you first must be transformed. And the reason, both historically and right now, that magic is considered dangerous or diabolical is because, first of all, what if it actually works, right? Second of all, why do you, as a practitioner, presume to have the right to change anything? Or to believe that you can actually control the nature of that change you are creating. There's a lot of great, more contemporary, like chaos magic writers like Phil Hine who kind of talk about a lot of that in depth. But when it comes to the relationship between what we want and the work we do magically, I think that's the main thing, is that you can't really expect to know what your work is doing. And this is part of why, for me, the practice of magic is not necessarily a different thing from the practice of art. I mean, the alchemists referred to what they did as the art. And my identification as an artist is, really about the practice of magic, right? And so to ask about something like defeating Elon Musk or Israel as a magical practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
it's similar to, well, what do artists do, right? Like, how does art work in the world? You can't really know. You can't really make specific demands of art. And yet none of us would deny that art makes a difference in the world, operating in that imaginal plane to subtly and often unconsciously shift the perception of the people who experience it as well as the people who make it. We don't doubt that art matters to the tides of culture and society. Magic operates in similar ways to that. There are resonances, to what we do. There's immortalities in what we do, and there's power in it. But how that ripples across the kind of web of existence is not something that is by any means easy or even possible to control. And yeah, definitely a lot of the contemporary kind of chaos magic writers like Phil Hine and Condensed Chaos are great people to look at in terms of getting into the nitty gritty of like, okay, but then what does that mean, and how do you explore this like chaos and desire in practice? So he's someone I'd recommend. And he also recently published a book called Querying Occultures, which is
That's
about
right.
a kind of queer reading of contemporary culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that even within like chaos magic as a practice, which itself is pretty like not really defined by definition,
Mm-hmm.
itself being a relatively you could say queer um, sect, if it's even a sect. There has been kind of a movement, it seems like, from it's like kind of has part of its identity as like being results based magic, right? We do magic
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get a result.
I love the
There's
idea. The idea of results-based magic is so
It's
hilarious.
funny,
Yeah.
but yeah, but there's been this the like I think a enlivening and like a kind of coming to terms with this other aspect of it, which is kind of, if you do try chaos magic and you do start getting results, right? Then you start to find, first of all, how much that changes you, and therefore maybe changes what you want once you have the thing that you thought you wanted. But then also, if you're actually being effective with it, to me it seems like there's a lot of, you end up being in contact with a lot of different forces and realities.
You don't know what you're letting in,
Mhm.
magic absolutely works, but you don't know what you're getting. It's
Mhm.
always going to surprise you. And also that question of time comes back in, these extended temporalities of how this kind of, how occult transformation works, right? Like, there's a whole segment of the class called occult transformation, exploring different ways that transformation happens. And one of them is, temporally across time. And even in one's personal practice of any form of magic, your relationship to time will shift because things won't play out on the time scale that you thought. And some things may not even be possible to play out within one lifetime.
Mhm.
And that's where a relationship to certain transhistorical archetypes and more deep time ideas becomes very important, where you're not locating the self just in your
Mhm. Mhm.
material conditions, but you are part of, a lineage and a story that is happening across a longer scale of time.
Mhm. I think you mentioned alchemy several times here. It's a it's an interesting lineage to be working in, and I'm interested in this thing about when I was trying to say like how you need to do something extra to try to describe love, right, or describe the person that you love. There's no being accurate, but it's like it's more of a verb. It has to be like a creative game where you
A
like,
process.
uh
Yeah.
huh. And you mentioned that like that kind of is what you need to do as an alchemist too. Could you talk a little bit about like what do you mean by that? What does doing alchemy mean in today's context, or in just in general, right? Like, what is the verb of alchemy?
Well, I mean, it can look like a lot of different things. And, for me, it is mostly looks like an artistic practice, but if you, the way to figure this out is to actually to read some of the primary sources, the treatises on the alchemical work. And I actually recommend jumping ahead a bit into some of the later stuff, from the 18th and 19th centuries instead of trying to read the like Middle English of the Renaissance alchemists,
Mm-hmm.
but like looking at like aphorismi or bigorani or like some of the compiled keys of the Rosicrucians and like or I love In the Cloud of Unknowing is a great one. And if you read about the nature of the alchemical work, of the magnum opus, you will find that there is no need to be in a laboratory to practice these ideas. You have to return to the instructions and find the the ways in your life where you can practice these principles, the alchemical stages of transmutation, which are described in great detail. There are step-by-step instructions in the process. You will find your own way to do that. It's part of why the cultural legacy of the alchemists is so rich and so diverse historically. A lot of great art, a lot of great inventions, feats of engineering, chemistry, botany, astronomy, glassmaking, painting, drawing, writing, because there's a lot of ways to do this. The philosopher's stone is no ordinary stone. It's a process of the transformation of the soul. So I wouldn't prescribe exactly what the practice of alchemy needs to look like. I would say you have to read the instructions and go from there.
Gotcha. Very exciting. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom. It's been really fun hanging out with you and talking to you. And it seems like if people are like hearing this, in the next week, they should definitely sign up for the course.
If
spots and
they
stuff,
should
right?
sign up. It's going to be a wild time. I mean, we're going to be racing across all of these topics and then some. I mean, hopefully the thematic structure will provide some help week by week, but it's going to be drinking from the fire hose for sure. And I mean, I'm excited by that because I don't claim to be an expert in any one territory, Western esotericism. My passion is in connecting lots of diverse ideas and kind of weaving this big net that can catch everyone and everything. I mean, I'm a Gemini, if you can't tell. We'll be kind of all over the place, and there's a lot of these ideas I feel like we've been talking about are very visual too. And so I'm excited about the Zoom lecture format for this because I've been, neurotically compiling this visual archive to go with these ideas. Because again, this is sort of where we started. What is the role of images in magical work and in the transmission of this kind of secret knowledge? And it's very important. Again, I don't really separate being an artist from being a practitioner of magic because there's lots of truths that you can't write down and they need to be transmitted in other ways. And so I'm excited about the visual aspect of it. And so, yeah, if this wasn't totally overwhelming, then sign up for more.
Yeah. I mean, and then also, like, to put it differently, like, I think we've probably touched on a lot of, like, the branches or little offshoots of things that would be more comprehensively unearthed through the multiple weeks of the thing. I love just opening up whole passages of knowledge and stuff, and I think this would be a really fun way to do that. Having class is something I crave, but I don't want to I don't want to go $40,000 into debt to do so.
Don't do it. Don't join any cults, including academia. Okay,
absolutely.
Let's stay on the outside.
Yeah, exactly. So it's nice to be able to share knowledge in a rigorous way, outside of the encircled.
Yeah, likewise. I'm so glad to talk with you about this stuff.
Yeah. So where should people go to sign up for the thing or to follow your work or
that is
whatever?
Through LaetitiaCartomancy.com, and we can include a link to that, and it's also linked through all of my socials and stuff, which is really just my website, artistjones.com, and my Instagram, Infowars.
That's ARDYCE
JONES, yeah.
And then Infowars on Instagram with 2 Z's.
2 Z's, like, yeah. The old Infowars is gone now, so I might be able to get the correct spelling.
Whoa.
I'm the only one.
Infowars, indeed. Thank you so much. What a joy. Yeah,
thanks, really Jackie. Till next time.
Sounds good.
1 has produced 2. 1 has produced 3. 2. These words mean has produced that 1, 3 has been divided. These words mean the female principle has been divided
and yang
into
the
yin,
male principle.
the female principle,
These two
and
have
yang,
joined,
the male principle.
and out of their junction has come a third,
These two have joined,
harmony,
and out
the
of their
spirit
junction
of
has come a
harmony.
third,
as it condenses,
the
produces
spirit
all beings.
of harmony. As it condenses, produces all beings.